Welcome, everybody. Tonight we're working on Unit 10. The topic is responsive web design. The one thing I'll just say right up front is the techniques that we're talking about tonight are not the only ways to create responsive web design. As we look back to the things that we've already covered, things like Flexbox, CSS Grid, and really the basic nature of HTML, as it was originally designed, is essentially responsive. But when we start to do layouts for websites and we start to make things fit into certain spaces or make things look exactly the way we want, we sometimes kind of lock them in to certain formats that we can't break out of without using some of the responsive web design techniques we're going to talk about tonight. So we're going to begin by looking at what the heck even is responsive web design. Then we're going to look at techniques for some of the things you see here. We're going to talk about the viewport. We're going to talk about responsive images and fluid videos and images. They're kind of the same thing. Showing different images in your browser depending on the browser width. There's a tag for that. And you know what? As I'm talking about it, I'm just going to list the tag here because this is how my brain works sometimes. Sometimes, I think about it in the aftermath and hey, whatever, I'll do the edit right in front of you guys. That's fine. We'll also look at some modern techniques for doing responsive text sizing. And what I will say, like in the past with that one, we usually would use percentages or M's, basically the same thing. And now they have this new technique, which has really rapidly kind of taken designers by storm, I think, where it's the VW. And I think it's like view width or something like that is what the acronym means, which means it's basically relative to the size of the window and nothing else, right? And when you think about it, that kind of makes a lot of sense, right? So a lot of designers are switching to that exclusively, by the way. The other really important technique we're learning here tonight is to apply media queries, which is kind of still the preeminent way to control websites for mobile. And then we're going to look quickly at two frameworks for responsive design. I know we were talking about it last week, how there's Bootstrap, and W3 Schools also has its own custom version called W3.css. I'm not going to dig in and demonstrate those, but I just want to put them on your radar that even though we've learned Flex and CSS Grid, and then we're going to learn media queries tonight, and viewports and all that. And then there's still more techniques for making stuff responsive. And as you kind of really get into web design, you will figure out that it's like, oh, you mean I can kind of do whatever I want? Well, yeah, whatever works, you can do. But remember, really one of the big goals of responsive web design is what we were mentioning before the video started, which is a propensity of all surfing happens with mobile devices, namely phones, and namely in what we call portrait view, which is tall and narrow, not wide, and short, so that is a challenge when we do most of our design work on computer screens like the one that you're looking at right now, which is wide, kind of tall, but not super tall, right? That's very different than if I took my browser window and did this with it. And notice, interestingly, what Brightspace does in that mode, right? And I'm using this as an example, but all the content is still there. But what did they do with like the sidebar? You have to go through the whole sidebar before you get to the content. Now, mind you, I'm in instructor mode here, so but I mean, I know for a fact that a lot of my students don't look at Brightspace on their computers. I mean, you probably have to do your coding that way, but there's a good chance you might, like, I don't know, watch the video on your phone, right? That kind of thing. And so these are considerations that are important. I was mentioning before as well that it's estimated somewhere around like 85-90% of all surfing is done on mobile devices. I shared a startling stat that, I went to this conference back, like 12 years ago or something like that. And back then Google had determined a mere 6 years after smartphones were kind of released pretty much, to the public that in people's homes, 70% of surfing was done on phones. And that's astounding as a statistic. And really, as you know, as a result, since like the mid 2000 teens, Google has prioritized their search traffic to go mobile first. So if your site is not mobile friendly, you can't really read it on a mobile device, they will deprioritize you in their search results. And nobody who has a website that wants to sell something or attract, an audience wants that to happen, obviously, right? You want people to come in, and if you know people are using their phones, well, of course you should design for the phone, right? And so that's really kind of the focus here tonight. What I will also say is before we get into coding, you can do a lot of things in your browser window to simulate a mobile device or a tablet or whatever, right? But there's nothing like looking at your site on a phone to really make the determination of whether it's working or not. So one of the things you might find yourself doing as you work through the materials in Unit 10 is create your page, you think you're okay, upload it to Prometheus, and then pull it down on your phone and see how it behaves, right? Another tip, and this is just kind of a common knowledge, I guess, general purpose kind of tip for web designers, is when you guys go out into the field and you do this professionally, you have to keep in mind what type of devices people look at your stuff with, and that just because you think everybody uses a phone or an Android or an iPhone or a Windows machine or a Mac, that all of those platforms have variances. They have different browsers, they have different screen sizes, they have different, connectivity issues. Like for example, like that giant video that you're putting on your website might load up great on your own machine. But I put that thing on the internet and try downloading a 1 gigabyte video, and you're sitting there for 3 hours waiting for it to hit your phone. Not only that, but you're burning up somebody's data plan at the same time. Yeah, not a good scenario, right? So these are like things that you have to start to think about. A lot of professional designers that are way into doing this as a living, right? And there was a time where I did a heavy amount of freelance work in web. And what I would do is on my desk, I would have a laptop, a desktop with multiple screens, big screens, small screens. I'd have a Macintosh, I'd have my iPad sitting there. I'd have my phone sitting there, and whatever other devices I could possibly have. And then when I would like do a project for somebody, I would make sure to test on all the devices and all the different browsers on all the different devices, right? Now, I will say that, for the last 10 years or so, because of HTML5, the browsers really are more consistent in how they look. But really prior to like 2015, man, it was horrible. You'd pull it up in a Microsoft browser and it looked great. And then you'd pull up Firefox and it was broken. And then you go to Safari and it would be different. And then you switch over to a Mac and, and it was just a nightmare. And you had to code for all of those, right? Because you didn't want to exclude anybody. What I will say now is it is a lot easier to do responsive design. And we don't have to really worry anymore about having like different style sheets for your iPhone or different style sheets, for different things. The principal approach really is to have one website structure and one CSS file or a couple, working together that control the whole thing and make it look great on all devices. And, prior to that kind of like mid-teens time frame, what a lot of designers would do is like you'd land on a web page, they would probe your browser to see if you were on a mobile phone, and then if you were on a mobile, they'd send you to a different website. They would just build a completely different website for mobile, and that is really not considered good, by the way, right? All right, so that's enough of the background information here. Let's get into the material. My goal is to kind of step through all this stuff. It pretty much matches very closely with the W3 schools page I already have loaded in my browser. So what I do like here, though, is they have a breakdown of all the different topics with all the different pages on W3 so that you can go right to the spot that you need if you need to review something. I do have some basic examples here. And you can use these as your guide generally, but sometimes you might have to get in there a little bit deeper. All right, I'm going to bring up my Brave browser. Once again, I'm a fan of using this because it's basically a Chrome variant, but it automatically blocks ads and trackers, which is a good thing. And even though W3 is a great site, it blocked 62 trackers on this site already, right? Because they got to pay the bills too. So when you come here and you click on stuff, they share that information with other sites. That's a crazy amount if you think about it, right? So, all right, let's talk about this concept of responsive web design. And the basic point really is what it says at the very first sentence, right? It's all about creating pages that look good on every device. Really, the three primary devices that people use are computer screens, laptop or desktop, right? Those are kind of lumped together. Tablets, and phones. Phones being probably the most important. Tablets, mind you, are kind of big phones. They're just phones with bigger screens in a way. And I don't know how many of you have just kind of cast off your tablets, because I went through a period really early on when like tablets came out and I was like way into them. And then I'm like, whatever. And then recently I've kind of like rediscovered my iPad and just love it to death, right? I just, I can't put it in my pocket like my phone, but like, if I'm in the kitchen, making a meal, my iPad's, what I'm using typically, because it's got a nice screen size. It sounds pretty good, that kind of thing. So there is a big audience there as well. And I mentioned the iPad because in the tablet market, really, iPad is king. In the phone market, we do have two operating systems, and this is really important. We have Android and we have iOS, and the formats of those devices are different, by the way. The other thing that a lot of people are not aware of is if I pick up a Windows laptop or desktop, the screen sizes tend to fall into certain parameters. Typically, a 16:9 is a very common ratio. But when you go to a Macintosh, they tend to use a 16:10 ratio, which is different, right? So their screens are a little bit taller relative to their width. And then couple it with the fact that a lot of people use large external displays. Like I have one on this side of me here that is, I think, a 27-inch monitor, right? That's pretty, it's like double the size of my laptop screen in front of me. And then you have people that use like these ultra wide monitors, and then you also have people that take monitors and flip them the tall way, right? Like a lot of people who document editing or work with spreadsheets like tall monitors instead. And you got to think about all those screens, right? But knowing that the phone is preeminent, we have to design for that. Absolutely. Okay. The point of responsive web design is that if you set up your pages correctly and you set up your styles correctly, your site should be able to adapt to the screen size of any device that lands there and looks good in the process of doing it and isn't keeping people from seeing the stuff they need to see. All right. Notice that here they say, what is it? It's about using HTML and CSS to automatically resize, hide, shrink, or enlarge a website to make it look on all devices. And they mention, once again, desktops, tablets, and phones, and laptops kind of go into the desktop category, by the way. Right. I know they have a try it yourself thing here, and they ask you here to resize the browser window. So they have like this example, and I'm going to kind of play a little bit, notice, with just the width inside the try it editor. So for example, I narrow it up, and this is kind of like a phone. Okay. I make it wider. All right. And this would be tablet view, right? Or maybe this would be tablet view, right? And you see how this blue box here is below. And then as I keep getting wider, eventually that blue box that's below pops up to the right, right? Because hey, the screen's wide enough. Why not put it up there? You know, why leave the space empty is kind of the thinking. And what's kind of cool about this example, right? And as I keep getting wider, I mean, that's pretty much what it is, right? You know, it's like it's either like this mode, or that mode, right? It's one of those. And notice, like when we get to the phone sizes, how the menu is still at the top, right? And the content falls to the bottom. And most of this is actually controlled by a number of different mechanisms. One of the first things that we're going to look at is this thing called the meta tag called viewport, right? So I want you to notice it's right here on the screen. And for those of you here in the session, I'm just going to chat it on over to you. And one of the requirements for our assignment for Unit 10 is that you add this to every page on your site, regardless of the technique that you use, right? And I want you to notice that it basically sets up a parameter. And really what it does is it controls what we call the viewport. And now think about this. When you're in a browser, you have the capability, if you want, right? And a lot of people do this, is they'll go here and they'll adjust their magnification. And you'll see, like right now, I'm actually zoomed in. And I do that on purpose when I'm teaching. Because if I go to 100% view, now you guys can't read the code, right? Or it's a lot harder, right? Especially if your screen's not really big. So I'm often zoomed in when I'm teaching. But what the viewport meta tag actually does is it resets the content. And notice how it says initial scale 1.0. It sets it back to 100%. So when you land on the site, you're not landing on it zoomed in, right? Or zoomed out, right? Because you can zoom out too, you know, and that's a little bit weird. So we'll talk about that in just a second. But if you start to engineer what they have going on here, and I'm going to zoom back in so you can see the code. I want you to make notice here of the techniques they're using to do this layout, right? This layout that they have on the screen is using traditional CSS floats, right? It's not using Flexbox or CSS Grid, or I don't know if there's media. Oh, there are media queries here. So I'm giving you basically an overview of some of the techniques here, but they are using floats, and you can see them, right? You know, float left, yeah, overflow hidden, and all that stuff. And then down here, they start to introduce what we call media queries, which are designed to respond to the width of the screen. And then when you hit certain widths, like you basically set thresholds for width, you apply different styling techniques to certain items depending on the width of the screen of the user looking at it currently, right? So if it happens to be on a phone, we might move something around or make it disappear or make it bigger or smaller, show a different picture or get rid of the pictures. Or think about like another way of handling like a menu. Like a lot of times on mobile, when you get down to this view, some people take the menu and turn it into what we call the hamburger menu, which is like 3 lines, right? So that's a technique. And there's no right or wrong. It's what you think looks good and works well for the user. So it's all in the eye of the designer. The beautiful thing about doing these techniques is notice how the HTML is pretty darn straight ahead, right? There's nothing really super complicated about it. So in principle, if you have well-formed basic HTML, it's all about putting the right stuff into your style sheets to make all the responsiveness happen. That's where the magic sauce is. All right, let's get out of this try it editor, but I think that's a really nice example of like how it works. That example is basically set up with CSS floats, right? And that's kind of the historical way that we used to do it. And you know what? It's still fine, right? It clearly it works, right? And you can obviously make it do much more. All right. So early on when we started working in this course, we did learn about meta tags, kind of, because they were sort of required, right? So why don't we do this? I'm going to start coding and I'm going to add that meta tag basically to my pages. Oh, I'm noticing something really interesting here. My Google Drive's not running. I wonder why that is. And normally it's running down here in my tray. I'm trying to get to my files, which I store on Google Drive, but they are not running. So now I'm launching Google Drive and I'm waiting for it to load up. Very interesting. I still don't see it launching. Okay. That creates a little bit of a conundrum for me, file management wise. Let me just try this again. It looks like it's trying to launch and then is stopping. Okay. So I have to do something kind of weird here, folks. Because normally I'm going to show you here when I'm, working here, my Google Drive comes up as my G drive on my system. And of course I went here and I'm like, oh, I'm just going to go to my G drive and I'm all good. Right. And it's not there. I'm like, okay, well, that means Google Drive isn't running. Why isn't it running? And I look for the icon here always. And I'm like, okay, it's not running. Why is it not running? And I'm like, okay, well, that's okay. I know how to make it start. So I came here and try to make it run. But as I click open, I'm noticing that it flashes up and then it kind of goes away. So something's going on. And it did it again. So I'm going to try a different technique. This is kind of a weird sideline, and I'm recording it. I get it. I'm going to see if I can run as administrator. Oh, that's not what I clicked on. Seems like it's still doing the same thing. So when we take a break, which might be sooner than later, I might pop out and reboot my machine and see if I can get it going. I do have a workaround though, and that is I can go into my drive through a browser. So that's a nice fallback. You can tell I'm not used to doing it that way because normally I'm just saving everything here. So in order to do my work here today, I'm going to have to make a local file copy of my work and then move it to the server. I am going to do my typical routine though, which is, let's see, to make a copy of this and see if we can do that here. All right, I think maybe instead I'm going to just download Unit 9. I'm going to bring it to my local machine, make it Unit 10, and then push it back up later when I get Google Drive working. I'm sure it's a hiccup. One thing that we could check, and I don't know if you guys are aware of this about Gateway, but we have a page. Is it like system status, Rachel, or something like that? Here, I think if I go to Text Central, right here, I'm wondering if Google Drive might be down. Google Apps seem to all be up. Okay, so it's not them, it's me, basically, is the answer, right? The other thing I do sometimes check as well, and this is kind of a weird thing, is the down detector. I know we were looking at it a couple of weeks ago. I'm not seeing any Google services listed. Well, Google's got some things going on, but all right. All right, I guess I'm trying just to show you like my process when I have an issue with my software. Um, all right, well, Rachel, thank you for the little note, and James, thank you for the note as well. All right, so I downloaded Unit 9 here. So I'm going to move this here to my desktop. And see, I'm having all sorts of interesting issues here today. All right. And now it seems like even my local system is misbehaving. So I think it definitely indicates it's a me problem. I'm going to go and extract my Unit 9 folder here. All right. So this is on my desktop. I'm going to go ahead and do my usual routine. I'm just going to copy. I'm going to paste. I'm going to rename. And then later when I'm all done, I'll just move it back up to Google Drive and we will be okay. Even if I have to do it through a browser. All right, so this is the folder I'm going to open inside of Visual Studio Code. And so I'm going to go ahead and do that. And I do want to close all my previous projects here. You can tell I was working with Python with my class last night. I'm going to open up the local folder. All right, and there's my stuff. Closing the welcome screens, and I have all my pages. Now, what I am going to do is I'm going to open all the pages. Everything except for my template. And my first task is going to be to add that viewport meta tag. I'm just going to use the exact same syntax that I pasted into the chat for you guys. And then, okay, it's kind of a question like, where do you place it in your code? And normally what I would say is up near the top somewhere. And where I usually do it, you know, frankly, is I usually put it in before the style sheet. So like right here, maybe. Some people like to put all their meta tags together. It's really kind of a personal choice. My thinking in putting it before the style sheet is if I put it in before the style sheet, the browser will be correctly scaled before we start to apply our styles. Right. So I'm going to place it right there. And then I'm going to put that same code on each and every one of my pages in the same spot. So I'm just going page by page now and adding the viewport meta tag. This is one of the required tasks, by the way, for the assignment. So no time like the present, you know, open up your pages, paste it in, and then cross that off your list. Right, so all my pages now have it. Then I'm going to come up to File and do a Save All. I'm going to zoom out a click here too. I think that's just a tad large. All right. So going back to the Brave browser here and looking at the viewport meta tag, notice it says this sets the viewport of your page, which will give the browser's instruction how to control the page's dimensions and scaling, right? And so, for example, they will give you these screenshots here. And notice how they are focusing on a phone here. And this is where it becomes relevant. Think about this. Have you ever gone to a web page on your phone and it'll look like this? And you're like, oh, great. You know, and because it's probably written in basic HTML, what's happening is it's trying to show it to you the same way it would look on a browser with the focus on it being wide and not tall, right? And you know what? It's so easy just to add the viewport meta tag, and by just doing that, it will make it behave a whole lot better, right? Um, yeah, so it says if you are browsing this page on a phone or a tablet, you can click the two links above to see the difference, right? And so here's how I'm going to simulate a phone or a tablet is I'm just going to narrow up, okay? And then I'm going to click on it and see what happens. All right, so, all right, and notice like how the image, Like the text is kind of adjusting, but the image certainly is not. Okay, this is the first image. The second one, notice how the image now is scaling also, right? And usually with Chrome, or I'm using Brave, but this is basically a Chrome variant. When you make this as small as you can get, this will be really equivalent to just about any phone on the planet, right? And so I think that's a pretty good example. So the viewport meta tag really does help. Just that one simple tag on your pages helps, right? Doesn't mean your image is automatically going to scale correctly, but if you're using basic HTML, it will, by the way. So another thing that we do quite often is we'll use what we call responsive images. So if I have an image, and I know that we've kind of demonstrated this a little bit in class, like I have an image and it's really super huge, and then I want it to, make my screen smaller and the image stays super huge. Oh, okay, great. That's a wonderful feature, if I only want to see part of the image. But what if I, want to see the whole image? So here, for example, it says if you set the CSS width property on your image to 100%, the image will be responsive and scale up and down. And we can actually experiment with this really, really easily. And you'll notice how this image is adjusting, right, regardless of the size. And notice that they have breakpoints in here where it changes, like right there, because they have a little ad bar that comes up, right? But the image is scaling, and this one is set that way. So if you want to like give this a shot, right, really all it takes is applying this to your image. Now they're doing this, mind you, this is happening in line, right, which really isn't recommended, right? Like you shouldn't do that directly on the image. So what a lot of designers will do is they'll give their images either a class or an ID, right? Or they use like the CSS naming conventions of hierarchy to focus in on one image and then make sure that it works that way. Some designers will go as far as just saying all images should have a width of 100%. But then you always have to ask yourself the question, 100% of what? Okay, so I'm going to play with this a little bit to show you like what can happen, both good and bad, by doing that. Let's open up our style sheet. So I'm going to come in here, and I don't think I have any styles on any images anywhere, honestly. So I'm looking through my code here. Yeah, I do not, right? And I certainly don't have any down here. What I'm going to do now is right down here at the bottom, I'm going to create kind of like a new CSS section. I'm just going to call it responsive stuff. And you don't have to do this. This is just me. So when I look at it later, unit 10 or whatever, I know what I'm looking at and what I added because of this unit. So one thing I can do is I can just take the image tag, right, and just set it that way. So all images, we just say width 100%. Okay. Caution, right? And I want you to think about this. The caution is 100% of what? And the answer is the element that contains the image. Okay. I have not hit save on this yet. You guys notice that? Right. So I intentionally did not hit save, but I'm going to bring up my my index page here. And I guess I'm just going to do it the old fashioned way since I'm working locally here. I'm just going to double click it. So this is what it looks like right now. I'm going to do my little split screen magic here. And I'm going to hit save on the style sheet. And let's see what happens in the browser. I'm not using the live preview approach, so I will have to refresh, but I should probably fix that, I guess. All right, so let's go ahead and save the style sheet. It's saved. Let's hit refresh. Okay. Case in point. You guys see my point here? This is why you don't want to put it on everything. All right. My blurry logo is now super huge, And okay, maybe if you're a Packer fan and you've had a couple of beers, that would look great. Right? But no, yeah, this is not really, does not look good. Um, all right, the image down here looks okay, right? That looks fine. It's 100% of what? It's container. And as I move it, right, well, I must have some sort of a fixed size on that image already because it's not scaling to the container, or the container is scaled. I do not have a huge amount of images on my site, and I'm trying to remember where I even have them. Here you go. Here's one, right? That one is scaling. Notice it scales with the site. That's fine. Okay. So it is not fine up here though. So this technique, while possible, is not really recommended, right? So I wouldn't do it that way. So let me just save this again and then refresh the page and make my site look kind of normal again. What I would want to do though, so if this is on the about page, and you know what, maybe instead of doing it like this, I should do the live server thing. That's the about page, right? Open with live server. Right, so there it is. This is the live server version. And now I'm going to look at this page and the code that puts that image on the screen, which is right up here at the top somewhere. So it's right here, right? So you guys see that. All right. So one approach I could do is I could put it in line the way it was demonstrated on W3 schools. But I think what might be better in this circumstance is to actually either give it a class or an ID, right? I'm thinking in general, a class would be better. And I'm just going to do something silly. I'm just going to call it like RESP, responsive dash IMG, you know, and that to me will mean that this is one that will scale automatically to its container. Right now, what's its container? The main tag, whatever that parameters the main tag has. So let's copy this class. Let's take it, save the page, take it to the style sheet, and I'm just going to put that in, but we have to put a period in front of it since it's a class. And then here we'll use that style and we'll say with 100%. Saving, and there it is. Okay. And my logo is okay. Right. Back on my index page, if you guys remember, I think that's it there. Why did that other image not scale? And I'm trying to look at why. There's no, I have an ID on it, Packer headline. So I must have put a style on Packer headline somewhere. Right. Notice I had already set a size for it. And not only that, but I set a max width as well, which is kind of where the discussion is leading naturally next, by the way. So I set a width of 100%, but I also set a max width so it wouldn't get too big. What I'm going to do here just for the moment is I'm going to get rid of that max width and save again. And then I'm going to go to the home page. And of course, it looks fine there. But if you guys remember when we were looking at it before and I was getting the browser bigger, it got to a point where it only got so big and then wasn't filling the container. And it's still kind of doing the same thing. Right. I think partially the reason for this, now did I lose my spot here in my code? I sure did. It like jumped way to the bottom. You guys catch that? Yeah. And when you guys see me doing this, then you pull out your find tool and you start doing that, right? Control F to get the find tool. With 100%, and really it should scale to the image. I guess I have to look at like what structure that's inside of. So then once again, I'm going to go back to my code here. Oh, and there you go. This is the Y, right? So I have a class or a div set up that's holding the image. So this class here might be holding it back. So center image, notice its width. I had set a width for that. Now, what I could do for that is also set it to 100%. And I just want to remind you, the reason I put this in, by the way, was so that it would center. This is what centers it. And I'll just put a little comment here. But now that I've switched that to 100%, let's go back now and check it out, right? And that's pretty darn good, right? This is all with 100%. If I do want to cap it out, right, I might want to consider removing these, saving it again. Let's go take a look. And now you can see that it's maxed out at that setting. But when it gets smaller than that, it's okay. But then at some point, it does that. And then notice the centering isn't working anymore. Right. So it's just like fine balance of like what looks good or not. My personal feeling on this is I'm liking it without this setting. And you guys might feel the same way about it. Because I think it does look pretty good when you get big. Hey, why not? Right? You have the screen space for it. And it adjusts marvelously. Okay. Let's go back to our notes here then. So that's the one approach, is to use the width 100%. Okay, so notice if you use this setting instead, the max width, right? And so they have a separate version of the image here. The image will scale down if it has to, right? Like, well, when the screen gets smaller is an example, but it will never scale up to be larger than its original size. Okay, so this might be good. One reason why this might be good is because that way it doesn't lose its crispness. Because like you guys saw with that Green Bay Packer logo, when I made that really big, what did it look like? Yeah, it looked really horrible, right? Because it's a small image and it was not scaling well. So if I adjust this screen size, right, the image will scale, right? And I want to make sure I'm looking at the right one. Okay, here it is. This is the right one. It'll scale when it gets smaller, but it will not grow, when you get past its original size. So now this is a setting that you guys have to think about when you're building your stuff. Do you want your image to get super huge? Like, what if somebody you had that setting like with 100%, and then they went on an ultra wide monitor and went full screen? You have the potential of that image looking just horrendous, right? Like blurry and pixelated and all that. So you got to wrestle with that. Maybe like on my site, a good spot to use the max width would be on that logo. Right. And if you guys remember, I had a hard time finding a logo because apparently the Green Bay Packers have it locked down pretty hard. And I had to like copy it and Photoshop it and all this stuff just to even get it. And I did not put a significant amount of time into it. But if I do look at this item, right, and I'm going to kind of bring us back to looking at the inspect tool, because I don't even remember what I called it, right? So like I'm looking in the browser, right click on directly on the object, right, is what I did. And then I hit inspect, and then it brings me into the code directly into that spot, right? And I can see what ID I'm looking for, right? And in this case, it's the header logo. And so that I can find here on my style sheet. And I think I just did HDR, and there it is. And oh, I didn't do anything to it. You guys notice that? I just let it be. So maybe I should try max with 100%. So let's see if that setting works for it. I'm going to save it. Back to the browser. I'm going to close the inspect panel. It should have refreshed, right? So it will never grow as I make the screen bigger. However, when it goes smaller, well, it never gets to the point where it shrinks, does it? Right? Because and the reason why is it fits, and actually it's not too bad. It looks a little uncentered up at the top, and I think that's because I probably have an extra space, and I do. Can you see that? I have extra spaces here, so I can make the low green center over bay a little bit. You know what? And I'm like one of those people when I see the problem, I like to go fix it right away. And yeah, check it out right there. All right, let's see if that like breaks my site though. Here's the refresh. Eh, it is a little uncomfortably close now, isn't it? Hmm. I know. I mean, you can get really, really persnickety about this stuff. And, I could do some positioning stuff to fix it. And I don't really want to go down that rabbit hole, but let's just do a little bit. Let's see if that does anything. Okay, a little bit better. I don't know if you guys are seeing that. I moved it down a little bit and over from the right a little bit. So down 10 from the top, over 20 from the right. And so, okay. Well, now it just stays on the line with, you know, all right. There's a way to fix that too, by the way, but later on we'll learn that technique. All right. I think that's pretty good. Let's leave that stuff alone. Let's move on to the next topic. All right. So the next topic is showing different images depending on the browser width. So this is kind of an interesting tag. This one, when HTML5 came out, they didn't include it with HTML5. So when it was like first published, HTML5 that is, they were still having a debate whether or not they should include this. Then later on they released it unofficially, and they just made it part of HTML5, and it fully works, by the way. But some people are saying, well, this will be HTML6 or whatever, if they ever come out with one. But really what the picture tag does, now think about like when you're working with audio or video, the standard when you work with those is that you have one file format that hopefully everybody can listen to or watch. And then if that doesn't work, you give them an auxiliary file format just in case. This is kind of the same way, except you're giving them different images. You're not like shrinking or growing the image that's there. You're literally feeding them a different image depending on the size of their screen. And look at how this is set up. And this one, frankly, folks, I'm not going to demonstrate because I would have to have 3 different images and resize them and all that. But let's go into their try it editor here and you'll see what I'm talking about. So when we're wide, right? And I want you to see like how the tags are here. And I assume right now we're looking at this image, right? And then notice that we have, well, actually this would be with auto. Okay, so this is the source image. And then we have, depending on the size of the screen, right? Small version, large version, and a medium version. And then if I start to make this smaller, right? Changes the image altogether. That's a little weird, right? But that's a thing that you do. Now watch if I go really super big. So basically, I'm trying to figure out why they have, oh, I see. So this is actually our fallback, right? So this is the image that appears if your browser doesn't support this tag. I will tell you all the modern browsers support it, right? So if it doesn't recognize picture, it will just use the image tag, right? Otherwise, it has basically these two different ones that it uses, and depending on the screen width. So max width 1500 would be this one, max width 600 is that one. It's kind of weird to give it a different image altogether, but you can do that, right? What I would normally do is I would just have the same image either cropped or shrunken down, but done so it looks sharp and crisp, right? And so this is one that you have to play with. One of the things that we have mentioned in the assignment is that I want you to use, either with 100% or max width or in combo, or use this picture tag. The picture tag I would call more advanced as a technique, but it certainly is pertinent if, especially you have scenarios where the other approaches are giving you trouble. This is kind of considered a fallback. This one has been working in HTML5 for quite a bit. All right, I think we're going to take a break right now and do a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll pick up where we left off. And just so you know where we're going next, we're going to talk about responsive text next. So I'll see you guys in about 5 minutes, which would put us at about 6:02 or 6:03. All right, folks. As I mentioned before the break, we're going to move on now to talking about responsive text size. And we're going to be using a different font size control mechanism called the VW unit. And it has nothing to do with Volkswagens, by the way. But if that's the way that helps you remember, fantastic. The VW stands for viewport width. Basically, the concept is the size of the text will automatically follow the size of the window, regardless of the window size, right, or scale. And I think that's really kind of an interesting proposition. Right now, I am at, and this is actually a really kind of interesting thing. Like, you guys notice I'm changing the zoom level, but the font is staying the same size. Notice how the other fonts on the screen are getting smaller, right? But the font in Hello World is staying the same size because it's relative to the size of the window, not relative to the size of the HTML. This is really kind of an interesting thought. The other thing that happens is if I switch, oops, and of course, that's not the window I want. This is the window I want. And start narrowing up, that text will just keep scaling smaller and smaller or bigger and bigger. And of course, I'm kind of losing it as I'm scaling here automatically, right? If you go ahead and you take a look at the setting for this, and I want to just go into the try it editor here, and let me make sure I'm at 100%, which I am. The setting is pretty simplistic, and notice how they're just doing inline styles here, but you can apply this anywhere on your pages. So instead of using pixels for your font sizes, instead of using M's or percentages, which is the older way of doing responsive, which is still fine, you can use this setting instead, right? And I formally, when you look at this, how do you describe it? 10 VW will set the size to 10% of the viewport width, right? So that's technically what it's doing. And it says viewport is the browser window size. 1 VW is 1% of viewport width. If the viewport is 50 centimeters wide, 1 VW is 0.5 centimeters, right? Or if you want to think of it as 1,000 pixels wide, right? 1 VW would be 10 pixels, that type of thing. So you can play with this quite a bit. And I think we were kind of looking at this, how those top 3 elements will just resize. And you can see why that's kind of cool, right? Because regardless of what your size of your window, your text basically stays in the same spot. It just scales automatically and beautifully, right? the text isn't scrolling from one line to another. Um, it looks really good, like narrow, like on a phone. It looks, well, a little large this way, you know, but it does work pretty well. In terms of my own site, like maybe one spot where I might do this, and I'll go, basically look at my header here, right? Because I have my text, my header text, and that's maybe a spot where I could apply this, right? And right now I have my font size set at 100 pixels. Right now I would have to do a little bit of calculation, because if I know that my screen is 1920 pixels across and I want it to be roughly 100 pixels, I could do some math to extrapolate it, and I might come up with a number that I think would work. All right, so I'm going to leave this style in place, right? So I'm just going to comment it out, and then it's that way I can go back to it if I want. That's kind of the point. And I'm going to try font, and let's just try their example. I think 10% is going to be a little bit excessive. So I'm going to try 8 VW, and I'm totally speculating, right? I'm going to go ahead and save this, and let's go back to the live view of the page. This is it. All right, doesn't look too bad. Now let's see what happens when I scale. Notice the logo scaling. All right, maybe not exactly the effect I want, but it is scaling, right? I could also see, another spot that might work well might be the menu. But these are very subjective calls, like if you decide to do something like that, I think that 1VW is kind of all right, honestly. Play with the sizes, see what works for you. I think that might be appropriate in certain circumstances, but maybe not appropriate in others. So, this is a judgment call on your part in terms of what you think will work. All right. We're now going to turn our attention to media queries, and media queries, I'm going to argue are maybe one of the more important approaches for doing this, right? So like, I think, the general approach here really is to understand what normal screen sizes are, and then to set parameters that adjust, or styles that adjust relative to certain breakpoints in screen sizes. So like, for example, it says here, media queries, you can define completely different styles for different browser sizes. Yes, absolutely. Example, resize the browser window to see the 3 div elements below, how they'll display horizontally on large screens and stack vertically on small screens. So, okay, that was kind of weird right there. Notice the green box. That's a little weird, right? And I keep moving. Let's get that all into view. Now they're stacked. All right, so like when you go to tablet size or phone size, they're stacked. When I go to wide, okay, there's that weird spot. It kind of fixes. Now, let's go into their triad editor on this and then kind of like play with this just a little bit more. Basically the same example. It seems to be working a little bit better in here than it is out on the main page. But this is kind of the thought, right? And I want you to notice how both the left and the right, the green and the blue boxes, are changing size, and then they stack at one point. So let's look at how they're doing this. Well, first of all, they are using CSS floats to do this layout. So if you're using CSS floats, this might be a good technique for you. The one that they're showing here, right? Because it's not unusual to have a 3-column layout. Absolutely not. So they are floating the blue box to the left. All of the boxes are floating to the left. And then we come down here and add the media query. And I want you to look at how the media query is put together. When we do a media query, we start with the @ sign, and say media. So at media. And then we also, and this green text here is not obligatory, but it's considered good practice. So in other words, that we are propagating to the screen. All right. So, and if your head is going, well, yeah, of course we're propagating to the screen. No, we're displaying it on the screen. Yes. So that also should trigger something in your mind. Is there a different choice other than screen that you could put here? And here's the answer: yes. Because you can write, and this is, we haven't talked about this, but you can write CSS so that when somebody goes to print your page to a printer, you can give them different CSS for printing. Or if it's going to a television set, you can give them different. Of course, that's a screen too, but there's a different media query for that. You can give them different CSS for a TV screen and then different for a regular screen. Now, most of the time, like 99% of the time, you're going to use screen in that spot, by the way. And then usually what you do is you say media screen and then inside parentheses, the max width of where this applies. Now, the thinking is that we're starting from narrow and working our way up to wide. So the point right at which this switches, and I want you to watch this number right here, this number up here. Right now it's at 795. And now I'm at 800. Okay. And see what happened? At 800, this will apply. So what it's doing is the left, right, and main each have their width of 100%. When I drop below, or excuse me, go above that max width, then this width kicks in 20%, 60%, 20%. So, the original sizing is for when the media query isn't kicking in. In this example, and I want you to think about this, they only have one media query, right? So they're basically giving you either a mobile or a desktop view. And that's pretty common, right? Just one breakpoint. Better designers will do three. They'll do one for wide screens, one for intermediate size screens, and then one for small screens. Now, one thing I often do when I'm teaching media queries is I take my students to this website, which is the Boston Globe newspaper, right? The reason I like to use this one as an example and kind of like put this in your head too, right? Like all the stuff that we do on the web, it really originates from the print world. And people that have been doing print news media for centuries knows a lot of the techniques for layout and content, because of their experience and how people read newspapers, and they've studied it, over the course of hundreds of years, literally. So like the Boston Globe, the reason why this website is notable is they were the very first website to use media queries and use them effectively. And they still use it, right? And their goal as a newspaper was to take the look of their printed newspaper and duplicate that on the screen. Because, the Boston Globe, if you're not aware, I mean, this is one of the oldest newspapers in the country, and maybe one of the more important ones too, in terms of, a local, well-researched news source, whatever. But you notice here, like when I'm at full screen, I'm going to make sure that I'm at 100%. Okay, I am. That it kind of looks like a newspaper, right? They have a little header. They have their old English type at the top. They kind of have a menu up here, and then they have 3 columns of information. One really wide column and a couple of narrower columns. Okay, so why do they make narrow columns? Well, they know from history, basically, that the human eye doesn't want to go all the way across the screen reading and going back and forth like this, because you kind of lose your place after a while. So newspapers, literally for hundreds of years, have been making narrow columns because they know humans' eyes don't like to scan very far because they lose their place. And then if I, for example, click into one of their articles here, I want you to notice the format of it, right? Not a lot of, all right. Yeah, so I'm getting blocked here. I'm getting subscribe blocked, but let's see if I can just click on a different article here for a second. All right, and I'm not going to scroll, but if I could scroll a little bit, okay. You would notice basically they have one kind of wide column and one kind of narrow column. A lot of white space on the side, and everything is centered. Um, but right as you take this site and you come out of full screen mode, and I'm going to make this tall here, right? Notice that even when I come in from full screen, there's kind of like like right here where all the content still fits. And then as I start to get smaller, watch what happens to the columns. I'm being very incremental about my changes. You notice how all the columns are kind of shrinking a little bit. Notice how things are scaling. All right, and I'm going to just keep going. And then, oops, now like the column on the left got dramatically smaller, right? And I'm going to keep going. Now they're kind of close to the same size. Wait, okay, one of the columns disappeared, and then we keep going. So this, I would call this like tablet view here, right? And we'll keep going, keep going, keep going, and then boom, now we're in mobile mode. And notice their approach, right? Now they just have one big image, a headline, and then you click on it to go to the article. Also notice what happened to their menu. That you probably weren't even looking at the menu along the way, but look at, like, for example, here, how the menu looks where it's all spread out. And then as we come in, right, they have a hamburger menu the whole time. But at one point, like when we get to tablet, notice how many of the things disappeared up here. And then when we get down to mobile view, it's all collapsed to the menu, right? And like I said, we call that the hamburger menu typically. But this is a great example site for media queries, not only because they were the first, but because they've strived really hard to make their newspaper look like this, basically, to look like the newspaper. So as we kind of move along then and look at our creating our own media queries, we have to start asking ourselves, what would look good, like, for what we've done to our work, right? And let me just check my zoom level here. I am at 100%, right? But I'm going to try something weird. I'm going to like zoom in, and then I'm going to hit refresh. Okay. And then I'm going to go back to 100%. Oops. Errantly clicked there, and I don't know if I ended up closing the window or Chrome may have crashed on me. How do you like that, folks? All right. It's one of those days. It's one of those days that where Google is having the problems, right? Amazon had problems, Microsoft had problems. Yeah, this is Chrome was updated. Okay, well, thanks. Thank you very much. All right, so we're back to our live view of our page. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of play with my screen widths and just kind of start asking myself some questions here, right? When I'm at a wider format, this sidebar is kind of okay, right? Because I really don't want people's eyes going all the way across the screen. I could even argue that I could split my content here down the middle, or have a wide column and a narrow column. I could do all that stuff. But at some point, and maybe when I get maybe down to here, or maybe even smaller, but certainly when I'm all the way down to here, that like width on my container, I think is kind of irrelevant, right? So I'm going to place a media query on my site to control the width of that container when I get down to a certain point. Now, I'm going to kind of arbitrarily pick a point, but here's one tool that you can use to kind of help you pick those points, right? And so we're going to go back to using the inspect tool again, and I'm just going to right click empty spot of the page here and bring up the inspect tool. As I resize the width of the browser window, I want you to notice up here in the corner for Chrome, as I'm resizing, it puts in a pixel count of both height and width. So like right there, I'm at 1200 pixels. And then down around here, I'm at 1000 pixels. right? So maybe at 1,000 pixels, I can make it wider, right? And then when I get down to, I don't know, 500, 600, and I think what do W3 schools use, like 800 or something like that. And I don't know, and you can see a couple of different things that maybe could be styled differently as I make my screen smaller. I'm not super happy with how this looks up here, right? So that would be an area that I might give some attention as well. Right now, I'm going to focus on the container though. And here's kind of what I'm thinking about it is if I am moving along here, let's say I get down to about this point, just under 800, and I'm in, okay, I'm looking at the main section here, or the wrapper is really what I'm looking at. So I'm going to click on that in the hierarchy of my code. And notice right now it's set to 75%. Now I can experiment with this. This is why the inspect tool is so cool. I can come in here and just say, well, when I get down to about this size, maybe I should go to 85%. And right now it's not responding. That's 85. So maybe that's even too big. Maybe 90% is what I want. Okay, maybe, right? Then when I get even smaller and I'm watching the pixels again, and now I'm under 7, let's go under 650, like right around there. I think at this point, I probably want to be 100%. The other thing I'm not really liking is this spacing here, right? So I could figure out what's causing that spacing, which is probably, well, what is causing that spacing? I think it's the padding. And notice, even though I set my padding globally, I could come in here and I could adjust this one if I wanted. Oops. Okay, that's inside my container. You see what's happening there? Okay, I think I want to keep that, honestly. Um, so it would be maybe up here somewhere. I forget where I put the spacing to push that down. Maybe it was on the header. Maybe it was on the nav margin bottom. So there you go. Right. I might want to get rid of that. But see, this is kind of like why we use this tool, by the way, is if you're trying to figure out what style to tweak when you do a media query, I can come in here, narrow up my screen, play with a couple of settings and see what it does. Do I want to do that? Probably not. Do I want to, this one I probably do want to get rid of. So I would adjust the nav margin bottom to 0, and I would change on my wrapper the width to 100%. So that's what I would put in my media query, right? And this is the beautiful thing about inspect. I can try the settings as I'm doing them before I go write the code. And now I have in my head a much better way to write the code. Now, if you don't remember the syntax for this, right, you can borrow from the W3 site, wherever I have that open, right here. So you can borrow this, and I'm going to mess with this a little bit. I'm just going to borrow the first part of it. I'm going to come to my style sheet. And normally when I do media queries, and this is just my practice, and it's not a rule, by the way, is I will create a section at the bottom, usually of my CSS document, and I'll just say media queries, and I label it so I know where they are and I can find them later. And I'll put in that initial statement. And I'm not sure if that's the point where I want it to switch. I might want it a little smaller, but we'll see. The other thing that you do is you put curly brackets in, right? And then I want you to look at how they do this. Okay, so inside that set of curly brackets, then exist your alternate styles. All right, so I'm trying to remember the styles I just determined I should adjust. And one was that the wrapper, so I'm going to go up here and just look at this, whose width is 75%. I want to make that 100. I'm just going to borrow this, if you don't mind. Then I'm going to go back down to the bottom and I'm just going to paste that in and I'm just going to change it to 100%. And then I do need to close the curly brackets. Right. And if it helps you, do the indenting too, like that. Right. The other thing that we noticed was that with the nav, was it had a margin bottom? Right. I'm going to go back up and confirm that. So I'm going to find it. So we had a margin bottom of 20, and I want to switch that. Oh, there's an extra semicolon there. Found an error, folks. All right. So the nav margin bottom is going to go to 0. So I'm going to copy that, come all the way down to the bottom. And then here, I'm just going to say nav, curly's, margin bottom, and we're just going to switch that to 0. All right. I'm going to save this. Let's go look at the live view of it. I'm going to close the inspect tool. Right. We're going to refresh, make sure that we have the latest version here. It should be the latest version. So here I am at widescreen. Right. Right. Still pretty wide. Now we're probably down to about 1,000 pixels roughly. Keep going here. So we should hit 800 pretty soon. There's 800. Notice what happened. Full width. That margin up at the top is gone. And as I keep collapsing, it looks okay. Right. And you see how it's responding very nicely now. And then when I get to a narrow screen size, I'm not wasting space with the grass, you know. In principle, it's still there, by the way. All right. Another thing, you know, I could do, right, is I could adjust my header up at the top and make it a little bit nicer as well. And you know, I kind of struggle with these ideas. You know, it's like what looks good or what looks bad. I think this looks okay right now. When I get to there, I still think it looks okay. But then when it gets to here, it kind of starts looking a little bit wonky, right? So maybe when I get, I don't know what size that is, so I can figure it out with the inspect tool once again, right? So we can kind of play with this and figure out that spot where the logo jumps, which is right at 655 pixels, right? So I can put in something that changes the logo at that point and makes the logo smaller. Okay. I could drill down and find the logo in the header. So I think that's right here. There's the image. And notice how I have these styles in here. And let me adjust this to the point where it breaks, right? And then I can play with these to see if any of these would help to fix it. This probably isn't going to be relevant, nor is that. But this certainly is going to be. And you see how that's not having an effect right now because I don't have a width declared on it. So really, I think what I want to do is probably add a width. You got to spell it right though. And then come up with an amount. And maybe I do want to switch to a smaller percentage. So maybe I want to make it 75%. Okay, no. Right, clearly not the right answer. What if I made it a certain pixel size? And you know what helps to know, and here's the other use here, hovering over the image, it tells me what its size is up in that little hover box. It says 130 by 84. So if and it's width times height, right? So it's 130 is the width. So maybe I set the width to, I don't know, 90 pixels. I'm just coming up with a thought here. So let's just type that in. Okay, a little better. See that? Right. And then if I make it smaller, does that keep working? All right. Well, I could get really persnickety about it and put it in another thing. And maybe really what I want to do is make it even a little bit smaller maybe like 80 pixels. Heck, let's make it 70 pixels, right? Um, and then that might work all the way through. You know, subjective. I don't know anybody's phone would ever get that small, right? A really kind of like a standard phone vertical screen width is about 480 pixels, which is right about there, and that looks okay, right? All right. So let's go in then and add a media query for that. This is HDR logo, right? Um, so that's where I'm going to add it in the media query. And I could have just copied that actually. You know, copy selector, copy rule. Well, let's just copy all of it. Right now, I'll take it over to my style sheet and I'll paste it in here. Okay, not what I expected, but you know, that width 70 pixels is the thing I'm shooting for, right? So what was that called? HDR logo. So # HDR logo, curlies. Don't forget to put your closing curly right there. And we'll see if this works. I think it might not work with that breakpoint. And if it doesn't work with that breakpoint, I might adjust it. You know, we'll see. Okay. So let's save this. Let's go back to the live view here. Make sure I'm refreshed. And let's start adjusting the screen. And we're watching that logo at the top. Right. So we see the container. So notice it jumped a little bit. I see a couple of issues with it. Like I think now it's sitting too low, but it's kind of okay, right? But I think it might be sitting just a tad low. So what I might do here is adjust top to, what did I have it set to? I had it set to 10 pixels. So maybe I change that to, I'm not going to say 0 pixels, but maybe like 3 pixels. And then right, I'll reduce the right one a little bit too. Maybe take that to 10 pixels. Right. And this is a process of experimentation. You can tell it's not like a hard science, right? So make sure that's refreshed. And there we go. Okay. What do you think? Not too bad for guessing, right? You know, and as it gets smaller, all right, still sort of works. Like, okay, maybe it still needs more than 3. Maybe it needs like, I don't know, 5 pixels, right? And once again, this process of experimentation, what looks good to one person's eye might not look good to somebody else's, but still, overall, not too bad, right? So these are things you're going to play with. And yeah, they have the tendency to kind of drive you crazy a little bit as you're working on them, real frankly, because they're very persnickety little settings, but they can have a big impact, especially when you go to mobile. And I think, you know, my site is becoming more mobile friendly for sure. Right. And all right, keep in mind, I got to check all my other pages too. Right. And this is what you should do. Right. And if there's anything that doesn't sit right in your eye, remember you can take your media query and adjust it. You can also have more than one media query. So you can set a breakpoint at, like a lot of people do, will set one at like 900 or 1,000 and then down around 4, 5, 600 somewhere. But this does not have to be super fancy. At the very least, I would recommend, you know, if you're using a wrapper like I am and you were narrowing up your content, that's a really easy one to add to get your points for this assignment, by the way. All right, let's go back to the materials now. If I can find my Chrome browser, and let me get Brightspace, you know, in here so I can get back into my interface. Looks like I got to do all my logins again. All right. And I think at this point, we're probably done with all the lecture materials. All right. We were going to look at these two frameworks. So I'm going to go back to Brave for a second. I forgot all about that. Um, I do want you to notice here that they do have a whole tutorial on responsive web design. So if you guys really want to dig in and follow their tutorial, highly recommended, by the way, it's a pretty good one. Just click through and go to that and check it out. They do have a responsive a web page full example here. And I'm just going to kind of bring this up, and I just want to show you like what they have going on here. So if this is like maybe a style you're going for, but notice how well it does respond. This is all CSS floats, right? Once again, and that's kind of their focus here. All right. If you find like creating this stuff from scratch to be cumbersome, right? Which a lot of designers do. It's like, oh my God, I worked all day to get this design, and then I forgot about my media queries. Now I got to work all day to fix my media queries, that kind of thing. And then, some people will create media queries that are very specific to make their site look a certain way on every screen. And it's like a whole art, of kind of trial and error and coding and all that stuff. Not that it's not achievable, but it's a bit of work, right? To really get your site to look good. So, and we talked about this last week. What some private organizations did is basically they created frameworks. Back in the early days when they first started putting out layout frameworks, one of the first ones I tried was this one called 960 Grid. And I don't even know if it's still out there. I suppose you can Google it. And then a little bit later on, they came out with Bootstrap. And Bootstrap is a combination of a couple of different things, right? It is first a CSS library, right? That you can just download and import into your project. And it's combined with a JavaScript file. We haven't learned JavaScript yet, but it's the JavaScript working in tandem with the CSS. And notice the viewport meta tag, right? They use that there too. That allows you to use their predefined styles to fit into a format. They do have an example here, so I'm just going to pull up their example. And here's an example of a Bootstrap page and like a 3-column layout and how it responds really beautifully. And then it switches to mobile, and the typography is beautiful, and it just keeps responding no matter what the size, right? Their technology truly is a grid. So they set up a grid, kind of like CSS grid, but a little bit different. They call them columns, and then you can have things be certain column widths. And I think it's a 12-column system, if I remember correctly. And then once you learn, for example, all the ways that you call things, you just use the Bootstrap terms, and then it just styles automatically and looks beautiful. And this includes typography, responsiveness, columns, all that stuff. It just happens automatically. Bootstrap is so popular that a lot of coding engines have it built in as an option, like, oh, create new website. Okay, include Bootstrap, you hit a little check mark, and it's just on all your pages. Boom, and you're done, right? And then you just start using it. So that it's a very popular tool. W3 also came out with their own system for doing responsive design. And they have a little demo here too. So let's look at their demo, which is similar. Notice, right? It does not use the same type of grid pattern. It's similar, but not exactly the same. But notice it essentially behaves the same, right? It's the same kind of approach. But it's unique to W3. So W3 basically noticed that there were all these people creating these grid systems, and they came up with their own called W3.css. That is strictly based on CSS. There's no JavaScript involved, right? I don't see this one as being as popular as Bootstrap or as Flexbox or as CSS Grid, but it's out there, and I'm just pointing it out to you guys. If you guys want to explore it, that's on you, right? So I'm not going to require you to do anything with W3 CSS or with Bootstrap, but I do want to put them on your radar as important frameworks that are out there, Bootstrap in particular, is pretty important out in the world of coding. And good chance, like if you worked for a design house, they would force you to work in that format. And the reason they do that is they don't want you spending your whole day doing typography and responsiveness. They want you to focus more on the content that you're putting onto the page. That's really kind of the thinking. So those are two very popular formats. Please explore them. There's also this little summary thing that I put down here, maybe help guide you a little bit on some of the stuff we learned here in this unit today. The assignment I do have posted. It's not visible yet because I'm making a couple of tweaks, but basically you'll have to put the viewport meta tag on everything. You will have to add media queries to at least one page. I would suggest doing what I did though, if you're using a container, and apply it to all your pages. At least one responsive image, at least one use of responsive text using the VW tag. And make sure you test your pages on all different things. And then if you apply the fluid video technique shown in the lecture notes, we unfortunately don't have time to demonstrate that one. But what I can do is just very quickly look at the example here. And maybe we can cover this one next time because it does include this concept of an iframe, which we haven't really talked about yet. So I'll make sure I add that to next week's topics and we'll talk about iframes. But if you were interested in making your videos so that they scale on your site, this is a technique you can use right here. And basically, iframe is the type of tag that YouTube gives you anyhow. And what they would have you do is put that inside of a div, and then you can scale the div relatively following these techniques here, and the video will scale also. Right. So that's something you can do. This is not obligatory, by the way, but I do put it out there as an option. And if I remember right, yeah, if you apply that technique, you get 1 extra credit point. So this might be something that appeals to you. And plus, if you want to earn the extra credit, hey, there you go. The code's already provided. You just need to find a YouTube video that works. All right, folks, that's going to be the wrap on unit 10 for tonight. We talked about a lot of stuff. We got through it all in time, just in the nick of time. So this video ends here, and I will see you guys all next week.